Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. At first I blamed the angles. The way this place is built, nothing feels square, but something's wrong. I'll cross the living room, then double back, and suddenly the wall feels closer. The hallway shorter. My bedroom door farther than before. I tried mapping it, measuring with string, even marking the floor with chalk. The marks move, sometimes disappear completely. And now, when I walk from one room to the next, I feel watched, but not from behind me. From inside the walls themselves, like the house is folding itself in, trapping me more each day. The smell started the same week I noticed the shifting walls. Sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in summer heat. It drifts through the rooms without source, stronger in corners where shadows pool deepest. I've checked every inch, no rotting food, no dead animals, no logical explanation. The scent follows me now, clinging to my clothes, my skin, as if the house wants me to carry its essence wherever I go. I began keeping a journal, documenting each anomaly with the precision of a scientist. Room measurements, temperature readings, the exact placement of furniture before and after. My handwriting fills page after page, but when I review my notes, the numbers don't match my memory. The living room that measured 12 feet yesterday shows 15 feet today. The kitchen doorway that barely fit my shoulders now swallows me whole. The walls breathe. I feel their pulse when I press my palms against them, a rhythm that doesn't match my heartbeat. The surface feels warm, almost feverish, and sometimes I swear I detect a faint vibration, like something massive moving just beneath the surface. I've started touching every wall I pass, compulsively checking for that subtle tremor, that impossible warmth. Recording everything became my obsession. I set up cameras in every room, positioned to capture the impossible geometry. For days, I watched the footage frame by frame, searching for evidence of the shifts I experienced. The recordings show nothing. Static rooms, unchanging walls. But when I walk through those same spaces, the distances feel wrong, the proportions alien. My reflection started lying to me. Not dramatically, just small discrepancies that make my skin crawl. In the bathroom mirror, my left shoulder appears higher than my right. In the hallway mirror, my face looks narrower. The bedroom mirror shows my eyes too wide, pupils dilated despite bright light. I've covered most of the mirrors with sheets, but sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in darkened windows, and even those reflections seem distorted, unfamiliar. The house has sounds now, not the settling groans of old wood, but something more deliberate. Whispers seep through electrical outlets, too distorted to understand, but unmistakably human. My radio picks up conversations that don't exist on any frequency, voices discussing my daily routine in flat, emotionless tones. I've unplugged every device, but the sounds continue, as if the house itself has become a conductor of unwanted transmissions. Sleep became impossible. Every night, I'd lie rigid, listening to the walls shift around me. The room would stretch and contract like a living thing, and I'd reach out to touch the familiar bedside table, only to find empty air. I started sleeping in different rooms, trying to find one that would hold its shape through the night. None did. The house remakes itself in darkness, and I wake each morning in spaces that feel foreign despite their familiar contents. I tried to leave. The front door opened onto the correct street, the right neighborhood, but when I stepped outside and looked back, the house wasn't there. Just empty lot, as if the building existed only when I occupied it. I stood on the sidewalk for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, until a neighbor asked if I was feeling all right. When I turned back, the house had returned, waiting patiently for my return. The walls have been writing to me. Not words, I'm not that far gone, but patterns in the paint, subtle discolorations that form shapes, symbols, messages I can't quite decode. They appear overnight, usually in rooms I haven't visited recently, as if the house is trying to communicate through neglected spaces. I've photographed them all, but the images show only blank walls. The patterns exist only for my eyes. My food tastes wrong now. Everything carries that same overripe sweetness, the house's signature scent infecting every meal. Water from the tap flows thick, almost viscous, and leaves a metallic aftertaste that lingers for hours. I've stopped eating anything prepared in the kitchen, surviving on packaged goods that haven't been contaminated by the house's influence. But even sealed containers develop that sickly sweet smell after a few days. The final shift happened during what should have been a routine walk to the kitchen. I'd made the journey thousands of times, but this time the hallway stretched impossibly long, forcing me to walk for what felt like hours through a corridor that should have taken seconds to traverse. The walls pressed closer with each step, and I could hear my own breathing echoing back in wrong rhythms, as if multiple versions of myself were walking the same path at different speeds. When I finally reached the kitchen, it wasn't my kitchen. Same appliances, same layout, but everything felt scaled wrong, too large or too small. Proportions shifted in ways that made my eyes water. I tried to retreat, but the hallway behind me had vanished, replaced by a solid wall that felt warm and alive under my desperate palms. I'm writing this from what used to be my bedroom, though the walls have moved closer since I began. The door is gone. The windows show only darkness, regardless of the hour. My reflection in the blank computer screen looks more distorted each time I glance at it, features shifting towards something I don't recognize. The house has what it wants now. I can feel it settling around me, satisfied, the walls finally still. But I understand now that the stillness isn't peace, it's completion. The house has finished reshaping itself, and in doing so, it has reshaped me too. I no longer fit in spaces that exist outside these walls. I've become part of its geometry, another angle in its impossible architecture. The sweet smell has faded, replaced by something else. The scent of home, of belonging, of being exactly where I'm meant to be. And when I close my eyes, I can feel the house dreaming around me, planning new configurations, new impossibilities for the next person who moves in. Because there will be a next person. There always is. The walls don't stay where I left them, but I'm not leaving them either. Not anymore. Did you enjoy this story? This one felt like a slow, spatial suffocation, less a haunting, more a consumption. What really got me was the moment the narrator steps outside and the house disappears. Not abandoned, erased, like it only exists when it's watching you. That hit hard. The smell, the mirrors, the echoing thoughts, everything in the house rewrote reality one layer at a time, until even food stopped tasting real. Now I am wondering, would you have stayed once you realized the chalk marks were moving? Or would you have tried to burn the place down before it folded you into its blueprints? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 2. The house has always creaked like any old place, but the sounds from the basement aren't random. They pause when I pause. They sigh when I exhale. I've caught myself answering them, whispering back nonsense just to fill the silence. Then one night, the creaks responded, not with noise, but with intention. The light bulb swayed violently without a draft. The stairs groaned in a rhythm I'd never walked. It's thinking. I can feel it in my spine when I stand too close to the door. It doesn't want me to come down, which only makes me wonder what happens if I do. I moved into this house 6 months ago. The basement door was painted shut. Layers of white paint sealed around the edges like someone had tried to make it permanent. The real estate agent mentioned it was storage space, nothing more. But storage doesn't breathe. Storage doesn't shift its weight when you walk overhead. The first sound I noticed was a soft tapping. Metal against wood, deliberate and patient. I assumed it was pipes settling, thermal expansion doing what it does. But pipes don't tap back when you knock on the floor. They don't pause mid-rhythm when you hold your breath. I started documenting everything. A small notebook, entries written in careful handwriting, because something about this demanded precision. The tapping happened mostly during the transition between day and night, when shadows stretched longest across the living room floor. It followed patterns, 3 short, 2 long, then silence. Always the same sequence, like a code waiting to be broken. The smell started after the first week of documentation. Lavender and copper, an impossible combination that drifted up through the floorboards. Lavender doesn't grow in basements. Copper doesn't bloom in darkness. Yet there it was, sweet and metallic, strongest near the sealed door. I found myself spending more time in the kitchen, directly above where the sounds originated. The tapping grew more complex, layered with what sounded like shuffling papers or fabric brushing against concrete. Sometimes I pressed my ear to the floor, feeling the vibrations travel through the wood into my skull. The house was trying to tell me something. The paint around the basement door began to crack, not from age or weather, but from pressure underneath. Thin lines appeared overnight, spreading like veins across the white surface. I traced them with my finger, feeling warmth beneath the paint that shouldn't exist in a house with no basement heating. I bought a small recorder, the kind used for meetings or lectures. I placed it on the kitchen floor during the evening hours, hoping to capture whatever was happening below. The playback revealed sounds I hadn't noticed in real time, whispers too soft for conscious hearing, rhythmic scratching like fingernails on stone, and underneath it all, something that sounded disturbingly like breathing. The breathing matched my own. I began testing this connection, holding my breath to see if the sounds would pause. They did. I exhaled slowly, and the whispers grew longer, more elaborate. It was as if something was learning my patterns, adapting to my presence. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't stop listening. The basement door handle turned warm under my touch. Not hot enough to burn, but noticeable, like fever heat. I pressed my palm against the painted wood, feeling vibrations that reminded me of a heartbeat. Slow, steady, stronger than what pipes or foundation settling could produce. I started having dreams about descending stairs. In these dreams, the basement stretched far deeper than any foundation should allow. The air grew thick and sweet, filled with that lavender copper scent. Something waited at the bottom, patient and aware, but I always woke before seeing what it was. The dreams began affecting my waking hours. I found myself drawn to the basement door, standing there for long periods without realizing how much time had passed. The painted surface showed more cracks each day, and through the largest crack, I could see darkness that seemed to move. I decided to remove the paint. The scraping revealed wood darker than the rest of the house, stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The door handle was brass, tarnished green, but solid. When I grasped it, the metal felt warm and slightly sticky, like skin that had been too long in the sun. The sounds from below changed immediately. The tapping became more urgent, accompanied by what sounded like furniture being moved across a concrete floor. The breathing grew deeper, more pronounced. Whatever was down there knew I was coming. I turned the handle slowly, feeling resistance that had nothing to do with age or rust. The door opened inward, revealing stairs that descended into perfect darkness. The lavender copper smell rushed up to meet me, so strong it made my eyes water. The first step creaked under my weight, but the sound was wrong, too deep, too resonant, like the house itself was groaning. The second step was cooler, the wood softer, almost organic under my feet. By the third step, I realized the breathing I'd been hearing wasn't coming from below. It was coming from the walls. The basement revealed itself in fragments as my eyes adjusted. Concrete walls curved impossibly, forming a space larger than the house's footprint. The floor was soft, covered in something that felt like moss, but smelled like copper. And there, in the the center of the room stood a chair. The chair was old, upholstered in fabric that might once have been blue, but now appeared black in the dim light. Someone was sitting in it, but the figure was wrong, too tall, too thin, with proportions that hurt to look at directly. It didn't move when I approached, but I could feel its attention like pressure behind my eyes. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as whispers, joining the chorus of sounds that filled the basement air. The figure in the chair tilted its head, and I realized it was listening not to me, but to something else, something that spoke in the language of creaking wood and settling foundations. The house was speaking to it, had always been speaking to it. I understood then that I wasn't the first person to find this door, to scrape away the paint, to descend these stairs. The house had been thinking long before I arrived, and it would continue thinking long after I left. If I left, the figure in the chair raised one impossibly long arm, pointing toward a corner of the basement where another chair waited. This one was smaller, newer, positioned at an angle that suggested it had been placed recently. For me, I backed toward the stairs, but the steps had changed. What had been wood was now something softer, more giving. The walls breathed around me, and the lavender copper smell grew so strong I could taste it on my tongue. The breathing that filled the basement matched my own panicked rhythm, as if the house was learning my fear. I ran. The basement door slammed shut behind me, but I could still hear the sounds through the wood. The tapping had changed, become more complex, more insistent. It was trying to tell me something, but I was no longer sure I wanted to understand. I painted the door again that night, layer after layer of white paint, trying to seal whatever was beneath. But paint doesn't stop thoughts, and the house continues to think. The sounds have grown quieter, but more personal, matching not just my breathing, but my heartbeat, my footsteps, the rhythm of my daily life. I've started looking for a new place to live, but every house I visit feels too quiet, too empty. The absence of that thinking presence leaves me anxious, incomplete. I catch myself listening for familiar sounds that aren't there, missing the conversation I never fully understood. The basement door is cracking again. The paint can't hold forever. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself standing before it with my hand on the warm brass handle, wondering if the second chair is still waiting, if the house is still thinking, if it remembers my smell, my breathing, my fear. I think it does. I think it's been waiting for me to come back down. I think I want to. Did you enjoy this story? What stayed with me most was the image of the two chairs, one ancient and occupied, the other freshly placed, perfectly waiting. That silent invitation was more chilling than any scream. And the idea that the house wasn't just haunted, but aware, thinking, gave me goosebumps. Not malevolent exactly, just patient like it's trying to understand you, reshape itself around you, offer you a seat in the conversation. Would you have opened that door once it started thinking in your rhythm? Or would you have layered the paint thicker and pretended you never heard anything at all? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 3. I've had scars since childhood. I know them like the back of my hand because they are. But last week, one near my elbow vanished. In its place, a new mark showed up on my hip. Same shape, same faded edges, but moved. I ignored it. But now others are shifting too, like they're being collected, organized. Last night, I traced them all in a mirror. They form a pattern now. Lines, like a map, a language. I don't know what they're spelling out yet, but I think when they finish, I won't be here to read it. The bathroom mirror reflects my skin under the harsh fluorescent light. I run my fingers along the raised tissue where my forearm scar used to be. The skin there feels different now, softer, like it's been reset to its original state. But the scar itself has migrated to my shoulder blade, a pale crescent that shouldn't exist there. I've been documenting this for days now. My notebook sits open on the counter, filled with crude drawings of my body marked with X's and arrows. Each morning I wake up and something has changed. The thin line from when I fell off my bike has relocated from my shin to my ribcage. The puncture wound from stepping on a nail has drifted from my foot to my forearm. They're not healing, they're traveling. I started taking photographs to track the movement. The camera flash illuminates my skin in stark detail, revealing the faint outlines where scars used to be. Ghost impressions left behind like shadows burned into concrete. When I compare the images side by side, the progression becomes undeniable. My body is being rewritten, one mark at a time. The sensation started 3 weeks ago. A gentle tingling, like blood returning to a sleeping limb. I'd wake up scratching at spots that had never itched before, finding familiar textures in unfamiliar places. My fingertips know every ridge, every smooth valley of scar tissue. They've been my constant companions since childhood, proof of scraped knees, kitchen accidents, the clumsiness of growing up. But now they're moving with purpose. I press my palm against the mirror, studying my reflection. The burn mark from grabbing a hot pan has appeared on my neck, just below my hairline. I remember the sharp pain from years ago, the way the skin bubbled and peeled. But it belongs on my wrist, not here. The wrongness of it makes my stomach turn. The apartment grows quiet around me. Even the usual sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, seem muted. I lean closer to the mirror, tracing the new arrangement with my finger. The scars are forming something. Lines that intersect and branch, creating a pattern that looks almost deliberate. I retrieve my magnifying glass from the kitchen drawer. Under the enhanced view, I can see tiny details I missed before. The edges of each scar align perfectly with others, creating continuous lines that flow across my skin. What once seemed like random marks of a careless childhood now appears calculated, designed. My phone buzzes. A text from my neighbor asking if I've been rearranging furniture late at night. She mentions hearing scraping sounds through the walls, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I haven't moved anything. I tell her it must be someone else, but the message unsettles me. I return to my documentation, sketching the current positions of each mark. The pattern is becoming clearer. The scars are mapping something, a network of intersecting paths that span my entire body. Some lines are incomplete, waiting for the remaining marks to find their designated positions. The temperature in the bathroom drops noticeably. My breath fogs the mirror as I exhale, obscuring my reflection. I wipe the condensation away with my sleeve, but the surface feels warm to the touch despite the chill in the air. The contradiction sends a shiver through me. I decide to stay awake tonight. If the scars are moving, I want to witness it happening. I position myself in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, notebook and pen ready. The digital clock reads past midnight, but I refuse to look at the numbers. The passage of time feels different now, elastic and unreliable. My eyes grow heavy as I watch my reflection. The The scars remain still, but I notice something else. The mirror shows slight distortions, subtle warping that makes my proportions look wrong. My left arm appears longer than my right. My face seems asymmetrical in ways that don't match how I know I look. I blink hard, trying to clear my vision. When I open my eyes, the scar on my collarbone has shifted half an inch to the right. The movement is so small I almost miss it, but I mark it in my notebook with shaking hands. The process is gradual, almost imperceptible. Each scar moves like a glacier, slow, inevitable, following some invisible current beneath my skin. I watch the burn mark on my neck migrate toward my jaw, leaving behind a faint outline of where it used to be. The sensation is neither painful nor pleasant, just profoundly wrong. I begin to understand that this isn't random. The scars are being guided, arranged by something that knows exactly where each piece belongs. My body is becoming a canvas for a message I can't yet read, written in the language of old wounds. The room grows colder. My breath creates small clouds that dissipate quickly in the still air. I pull a blanket around my shoulders, but find no warmth. The chill seems to emanate from within, as if my core temperature is dropping with each repositioned scar. I try to photograph the movement, but the camera captures only static images. The progression is too subtle for technology to detect, visible only to the human eye that knows what to look for. I continue sketching, documenting each incremental change as my body transforms itself. The pattern is almost complete now. The scars have formed a complex web of intersecting lines that reminds me of a circuit board or a map of underground tunnels. Each mark serves as a node in a larger network, connected to the others by invisible threads of intention. I realize I'm no longer just observing. I'm participating. My breathing has synchronized with the movement of the scars, each exhale corresponding to a shift in position. My heartbeat seems to be driving the process, pumping something other than blood through my veins. The mirror reflects a version of myself I don't recognize. The rearranged scars have changed my appearance in subtle ways, altering the landscape of my skin. I look like someone else wearing my face, someone who has lived a different life and collected different wounds. The final scar settles into place, just as dawn light begins to filter through the curtains. The small cut on my palm from opening a package has migrated to my forehead, completing the pattern. The network of marks now covers my entire body, creating a continuous design that pulses with its own rhythm. I stare at my reflection, trying to decipher the message written in my flesh. The scars spell out something in a language I don't understand, but I can feel its meaning pressing against the edges of my consciousness. It's a map, a set of instructions, an invitation to somewhere I don't want to go. My phone rings, startling me. The caller ID shows my own number. I let it go to voicemail, but the sound of my own voice leaves a message I don't remember recording. It speaks in words I don't recognize, in a tone that doesn't sound like mine. I look back at the mirror, and for just a moment, I see someone else looking back. The reflection moves independently, tracing the scar pattern with fingers that mirror my own, but belong to something else. When I blink, it's just me again, but the feeling of being watched remains. The scars have stopped moving, but I know this isn't over. The pattern is complete, but incomplete. It's waiting for something, a signal, a command, a moment when the conditions are right. I can feel it building like pressure behind my eyes, like the moment before a storm breaks. I close my notebook and step away from the mirror. The reflection stays behind, still tracing the lines that map my skin. As I leave the room, I catch a glimpse of movement in the glass, my reflection continuing its study of the pattern, learning to read the language written in my scars. The marks may have finished their journey, but I have the sinking feeling that mine is just beginning. Did you enjoy this story? What gripped me the most was the realization that the scars weren't fading or healing. They were relocating, almost like runes shifting into place. The way the body became a living map, with each wound a letter in a language never meant to be spoken at S, deeply unsettling, but also poetic in a way that lingers long after reading. That moment when the narrator sees their own reflection tracing the lines independently, chilling. It suggests the self has already split, already started leaving. What would you do if your own body began rearranging your scars without consent? Would you try to stop it, or start deciphering what the pattern means? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 4. It's only when I'm perfectly still that I hear it. A faint hum like breathing but deeper. The floorboards creak softly, but not from weight or pressure. It's more like murmuring, like they're talking among themselves. The first time I leaned close and almost made out words. Since then, I can't stop listening. I sleep on the couch just to be closer. I stopped stepping in certain spots. They shudder when I do. Yesterday, I dropped a glass, and the wood seemed to recoil before it shattered. I don't think I live on this floor anymore. I think I'm being carried. The apartment had been perfect when I moved in. Hardwood floors throughout, aged and beautiful, with their deep amber grain running like rivers through each plank. I'd run my fingers along the smooth surface, feeling the slight imperfections that spoke of decades of life lived above them. The realtor had mentioned the building's history, something about craftsmen who took pride in their work. But I wasn't really listening. I was already imagining my furniture arranged just so. My books lining the built-in shelves. My life settling into these warm wooden bones. That first night, I lay on my back in the center of the living room, staring at the ceiling and breathing in the scent of old wood and fresh beginnings. The silence was complete, the kind of deep quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I closed my eyes and felt the solid reliability of the floor beneath me, supporting me without question or complaint. That's when I first heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself it was the building settling, pipes expanding, the normal sounds of an old structure adjusting to the night. But there was something rhythmic about it, something that seemed to pulse with intention. I held my breath and pressed my ear to the floor. The wood was warm against my cheek, and I could swear I felt the slightest vibration, like a gentle current running through the grain. The whisper came again, closer now, as if my stillness had encouraged it. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably conversational. One voice, then another, overlapping in what sounded like urgent consultation. I pulled back, heart hammering, and the sound stopped immediately. The silence felt different now, expectant. I waited, barely breathing, but the whispers had retreated into whatever hidden spaces they inhabited during the day. Over the following weeks, I began to map the sounds. They were strongest in the living room, near the center where the oldest planks lay in perfect parallel lines. Fainter in the bedroom, almost absent in the kitchen where newer flooring had been installed. I started keeping a notebook, documenting the patterns I discovered the whispers came only when I was motionless. Any movement, even shifting my weight, would silence them instantly. But if I lay perfectly still, they would emerge gradually, like shy creatures venturing from their hiding places. I learned to control my breathing, to minimize the rise and fall of my chest, to become as statue-like as possible. The conversations grew bolder. What had been mere whispers became distinct murmurs, still too low to understand, but rich with emotion. Sometimes they sounded concerned, other times excited. Once, I swear I heard something like laughter, a dry rustling that made my skin prickle. I started sleeping on the living room floor. At first, I told myself it was temporary, just until I could understand what was happening. But as the nights passed, my bed began to feel wrong, too far from the source of the mystery. The couch became my new sleeping spot, positioned perfectly to catch every nuance of the nocturnal conversations happening inches below. The wood began to respond to my presence in other ways. When I walked across certain planks, they would give a slight shudder, not the normal flex of weight bearing, but something more like a flinch. I started avoiding those spots, stepping carefully around them, as if navigating a minefield of sensitivity. One morning, I noticed that the grain in one particular board had shifted slightly. The dark lines that I'd memorized were now arranged differently, swirling in patterns that seemed almost like writing. I knelt and traced the new configuration with my finger, and the wood grew warm beneath my touch. The whispers started immediately, more urgent than ever, and I could swear I heard my name woven into the incomprehensible syllables. I began recording everything. My phone captured only silence, but I documented the visual changes, the way certain boards seemed to breathe when I wasn't looking directly at them, the subtle shifts in temperature and texture that my bare feet could detect. The notebook filled with observations that read like the journal of someone losing their grip on reality. The glass incident changed everything. I'd been carrying water from the kitchen when I stepped on one of the sensitive spots. The plank didn't just shudder, it recoiled, actually pulling away from my foot with such force that I stumbled. The glass flew from my hand, and in the split second before it hit the floor, I saw the wood beneath it actually curve downward, as if trying to get out of the way. The shards scattered across the living room, and I noticed that they avoided certain areas entirely. clustering in specific patterns that seemed to follow the grain of the wood. As I cleaned up the pieces, I realized the floor was directing the glass, guiding it away from sensitive spots, like a protective parent shielding a child from harm. That night, I lay on my stomach with my cheek pressed against the warmest board, the one where the grain had rearranged itself. The whispers came immediately, stronger and clearer than ever before. I could almost make out words now, almost understand the urgent messages being passed between the voices below. Then I felt it, a gentle lifting sensation, as if the floor was rising to meet me. Not dramatically, just a subtle elevation that made me feel like I was floating on a wooden sea. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just talking among themselves anymore. They were talking to me. I tried to push myself up to break the connection, but the wood held me gently but firmly. Not trapped exactly, but encouraged to stay, to listen, to understand. The grain beneath my palms had become warm and slightly soft, molding itself to the shape of my hands like living flesh. The whispers resolved into something almost like words, syllables that brushed against the edges of comprehension. I caught fragments: safe, carry, together, home. The meaning danced just beyond my grasp, but the emotion was clear. These voices, whatever they were, cared about me. They wanted something from me, or for me. I spent the entire night like that, cradled by the responsive wood, listening to conversations that seemed to include me even though I couldn't participate. When dawn broke, the voices faded gradually, reluctantly, like friends saying goodbye after a long evening together. I stood on shaking legs, looking down at the floor that had held me through the night. The boards looked normal in the morning light, but I could see the subtle differences now, the way they fitted together more snugly, the way the grain seemed to flow in patterns that suggested hidden depths. Days blurred together after that. I found myself spending more and more time on the floor, drawn by the promise of those whispered conversations. I ate my meal sitting, cross-legged on the warm wood, worked at my laptop while lying on my stomach, conducted my entire life from this new perspective. The floor began to change more noticeably. Boards that had been separate now seemed to flow together seamlessly. The color deepened, taking on richer amber tones that seemed to pulse with internal light. The whispers became constant background music, a gentle murmur that followed me even when I moved around the apartment. Friends called, but I found it hard to explain why I couldn't meet them at restaurants or cafes. How could I tell them that I needed to be here, that the floor required my presence, that leaving felt like abandoning family? Their voices through the phone sounded distant and artificial compared to the warm, organic whispers that had become my constant companions. One evening, I realized I hadn't left the apartment in over a week. The thought should have alarmed me, but instead, I felt a deep contentment. Everything I needed was here, in this small space where the wood knew me and cared for me. The whispers had become clearer, more personal, sharing secrets about the building's history, about the craftsmen who had poured their souls into these planks, about the long chain of lives that had walked across this floor before me. I learned that the wood remembered everything, every footstep, every dropped tear, every moment of joy and sorrow that had occurred in this space. The whispers were the accumulated memories of decades, a living archive of human experience, encoded in the grain and growth rings of trees that had stood for centuries before becoming my floor. And now I was part of that archive. My presence, my stillness, my willingness to listen had made me a permanent part of the floor's memory. The boards had been waiting for someone like me, someone who could hear their stories and add their own to the collection. The lifting sensation became more pronounced. When I lay down now, the floor would rise gently to meet me, conforming to my body like a wooden embrace. I could feel the network of connections beneath the surface, the way each board communicated with its neighbors, passing information and sensation through an organic internet of wood and memory. Last night, something shifted. The whispers took on a new urgency, and I realized they weren't just sharing stories anymore. They were making plans. Plans that included me. Plans that required my permanent participation in their wooden community. I tried to stand to break the connection, but the floor held me gently. Not trapped, they seemed to say, but needed. Essential. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, explaining in their incomprehensible language that I was home now, that I belonged here, that leaving would hurt not just me, but the entire network of consciousness that had grown around my presence. I'm lying here now, feeling the slow pulse of the wood beneath me, listening to conversations that span generations. The floor has become softer, more welcoming, molding itself to my body like a perfectly fitted bed. The whispers have become a lullaby, promising safety and belonging and eternal communion with the memories stored in these ancient planks. The apartment above me, the world beyond these walls, feels increasingly distant and irrelevant. Why would I need anything else when I have this perfect understanding, this complete acceptance? The wood knows me better than I know myself, holds my secrets in its grain, carries my weight without complaint. I realize now that I haven't been living on this floor. I've been living in it, becoming part of its structure, adding my own memories to its vast collection. The whispers aren't coming from below me anymore. They're coming from within me, through me, as if I've become another board in the endless expanse of wooden consciousness. The grain beneath my palms has started to match the patterns in my own skin, and I can feel my heartbeat synchronizing with the subtle pulse of the wood. Soon, I think, there won't be any distinction between where I end and the floor begins. The whispers will be my whispers. The memories will be my memories. And I'll be home in the deepest, most permanent way possible. The floor is carrying me now, just as I suspected from the beginning. Carrying me into something larger than myself, something that has been waiting patiently for decades for someone willing to listen, to understand, to stay. And I am willing, I am ready, I am home. Did you enjoy this story? There's something deeply eerie and tender about being chosen by something as silent and solid as a floor. The way the wood begins to respond, to breathe, to remember, it is haunting, not because it traps you, but because it invites you. And that is what makes the ending so devastating. You ray not taken, you belong now. The most chilling part, that sense of comfort of being held, while everything else, the world, the self, slowly dissolves. So tell me, would you have listened to the floor? Or would you have fled the moment it whispered your name? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 5. Every night, I lie in bed and stare up, counting the same discolored tiles, the same old water stains. But when I close my eyes, the ceiling lowers. I can feel it pressing down, inch by inch. When I open them again, it's back to normal. But it's not. The cracks are different. The fan blades shift slightly left. I marked one tile with ink. It vanished by morning. I left my phone filming overnight. The footage froze just as the camera tilted upward. Only static, with a faint groan under the noise. I think the ceiling wants to reach me. The first thing I noticed was the sound. A subtle creaking, like wood expanding in heat. But my ceiling is concrete and plaster. It happens only when I'm perfectly still, lying flat on my back, breathing shallow and quiet. If I move even slightly, the sound stops. If I hold my breath, it continues, growing more defined, more deliberate. I started keeping a notebook beside my bed. Every morning, I would sketch the ceiling pattern from memory, documenting each crack, each stain, each imperfection. The drawings never matched the night before. Small details shifted. A watermark would stretch an inch longer. A hairline crack would branch into a fork. The light fixture would hang a degree off-center. The air in my bedroom began to smell different too. Not unpleasant, but wrong. Like rain on hot concrete, but we hadn't had rain in weeks. Sometimes I caught hints of something metallic, copper-like, as if the ceiling was bleeding rust through invisible wounds. The scent would be strongest when I first opened my eyes after keeping them closed for more than a few seconds. I decided to measure everything. Using a laser pointer and a measuring tape, I mapped the exact distance from my bed to the ceiling. 8 feet, 2 inches. Every morning, I would measure again. The distance never changed, but the ceiling felt closer. My body knew something my instruments couldn't detect. The pressure started as a whisper against my skin. When I lay still with my eyes closed, I could feel a weight settling above me, not quite touching, but present. Like standing under a low bridge, that instinctive urge to duck even when there's clearance. My chest would tighten, my breathing would become shallow, not from fear, but from the physical sensation of something massive hovering just beyond reach. I bought a motion sensor camera, the kind used for security, and mounted it in the corner of my room. Every morning, I would check the footage. The camera would capture me lying still, eyes closed, completely motionless. But the timestamp would skip. 2 minutes would become 7. 5 minutes would stretch to 15. The lost segments contained nothing but static, punctuated by that same low groan I'd heard before. The groaning sound started appearing in other recordings too. My phone calls had it in the background, barely audible, but there. Voice messages I left for friends played back with that same frequency underneath my words. Even my alarm clock radio would emit the sound between stations, soft and rhythmic, like breathing through thick liquid. I tried sleeping on the couch, but the problem followed me. The living room ceiling began exhibiting the same behavior. The popcorn texture would shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The corners would appear deeper, shadows pooling in ways that defied the light sources. I could feel the same presence above me, patient and persistent. My neighbor asked if I was doing construction work. She said she could hear rhythmic tapping through the walls, always coming from my apartment, always happening when I was supposed to be sleeping. But I never heard tapping. I only heard the groaning, the creaking, the sound of something vast and heavy settling into place. The ceiling began to warm, not from heating or electrical issues, but from something else. When I reached up to touch it, the surface felt feverish, pulsing with a heat that reminded me of skin. The texture was wrong too, smoother in some places, rougher in others, as if it was changing composition while I slept. I started sleeping with my eyes open. The effort was exhausting, my vision blurring from the strain, but I was determined to catch whatever was happening. On the third night of this experiment, I saw it. The ceiling rippled, not a trick of tired eyes, but actual movement, like water disturbed by a stone. The ripple spread from the center outward, gentle waves that made no sound, but carried that familiar groaning underneath. I grabbed my phone to record, but the screen went black. Not dead, not broken, just displaying nothing. The room's overhead light flickered once, then returned to normal. When I looked back up, the ceiling was still, but something had changed. The water stain I'd been using as a reference point was gone, replaced by a perfect circle of unmarked plaster. The next morning, I found my notebook filled with drawings I hadn't made. Page after page of ceiling sketches, each one showing the same space, but from different angles, as if drawn by someone floating above my bed. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of creating these detailed architectural studies. Some pages showed cross-sections, revealing empty space above the ceiling, vast caverns that couldn't exist in my building's structure. I called a building inspector, claiming I was worried about structural integrity. He found nothing wrong. The ceiling was solid, properly installed, completely normal. But while he was examining the corner where my camera was mounted, his voice changed. He started speaking slower, his words slightly echoing as if he was talking into a tunnel. When he finished his inspection, he looked at me with confusion and asked why I had called him to look at the floor, the boundary between sleep and waking began to blur. I would close my eyes for what felt like seconds, only to open them and find hours had passed. During these lost periods, my phone would record nothing but static, but the room would be different when I returned. Furniture shifted slightly, books reorganized themselves, and always, the ceiling would be just a little bit closer. I can feel it now as I write this. The pressure above me is constant, no longer requiring closed eyes to manifest. The ceiling breathes with me, expands and contracts in perfect synchronization with my lungs. The groaning sound has become a whisper, words in a language I don't recognize, but somehow understand. It's telling me to look up. It's telling me to reach up. It's telling me that the distance between us is smaller than I think, that the boundary between ceiling and sky is thinner than paper, that all I have to do is stretch my hand a little higher, and I'll touch something wonderful and terrible and completely inevitable. The water stain has returned, but now it looks like a handprint. My handprint. Palm pressed against the plaster from the inside, as if I'm already up there, already part of whatever waits above, pressing down, trying to reach the person I used to be. I don't think I'm sleeping in my bed anymore. I think I'm floating just below the ceiling, looking down at an empty room, waiting for someone to look up and see me pressed against the inside of the plaster, my face flattened against the surface, my mouth open in a silent groan that echoes through every recording, every phone call, every quiet moment when the world holds its breath. The ceiling doesn't move when I close my eyes anymore. I move when the ceiling closes its eyes. And it's been keeping them closed for so long now that I'm starting to forget which side of the plaster I'm supposed to be on. Did you enjoy this story? The ceiling turning into something alive, aware, and hungry for connection. It is a quiet kind of horror, the kind that presses on you slowly until you can tell where you end and it begins. The dread isn't in what the ceiling does, but in what it becomes, in what you become with it. That last image, your own handprint from the wrong side, chills deeper than any scream. What would you have done the moment that ceiling breathed back? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 6. I thought I saw it lag once, just a second behind me. I shrugged it off, but now it hesitates. If I turn quickly, it freezes. If I move slowly, it moves ahead. It used to be mine, tied to me like a silent twin. twin. But now it's behaving more like a visitor, one who's watched long enough to grow curious. Sometimes I catch it leaning ever so slightly in a direction I didn't go. Yesterday, its hands twitched before mine did. It's learning, and I think soon it won't need me to move at all. The first sign that something had shifted came during my morning routine. I was brushing my teeth, watching myself in the bathroom mirror, when I noticed the shadow cast by the overhead light seemed to pause mid-stroke. My hand kept moving, but the dark silhouette on the wall held still for just a heartbeat too long. The toothpaste foam felt suddenly bitter against my tongue, and I spat it out with more force than necessary. I convinced myself it was fatigue. Work had been demanding lately, and sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. But as the days passed, the discrepancies became impossible to ignore. My shadow would reach for objects before I decided to pick them up. It would turn its head toward sounds I hadn't yet registered. When I walked down the hallway, I could see it in my peripheral vision, moving with a rhythm that didn't quite match my steps. The weight of observation began to settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. I started paying attention to every surface that could cast a reflection or shadow. The kitchen window during breakfast, the glass doors at the office, the polished floor of the elevator. Each time, I would catch my dark companion behaving with a subtle independence that made my skin crawl. I began documenting everything. A small notebook became my constant companion, filled with observations written in increasingly frantic handwriting. Shadow moved left hand before I lifted coffee cup. Dark shape on wall nodded before I agreed to meeting. Silhouette on sidewalk stopped walking while I continued forward for 3 steps. The air in my apartment started to feel different, thicker somehow, as if another presence was sharing the same space, breathing the same oxygen. I would catch whiffs of something metallic, like old coins left in a pocket too long. Sometimes there was a floral scent, sweet and cloying, that had no source I could identify. My reflection in mirrors began to feel like a negotiation. I would move slowly, deliberately, watching to see if my shadow would follow or lead. The bathroom mirror became a battleground of wills. I would raise my right hand, and my shadow would raise its left. I would step forward, and it would step back. The person staring back at me looked increasingly hollow-eyed, as if the constant vigilance was draining something essential from my features. Electronics started behaving strangely. My phone would vibrate when no messages came through, the screen lighting up to show nothing but my own face reflected in the black surface. The television would flicker between channels I hadn't selected, and in the static, I could swear I heard whispers that sounded almost like my own voice, but distorted, as if spoken through water. The walls of my apartment began to feel alive. When I pressed my palm against them, they seemed to pulse with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. The temperature would shift unpredictably. One moment warm enough to make me remove my sweater, the next cold enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. The hardwood floors would creak under footsteps that weren't mine, always just out of sync with my own movements. I started sleeping with the lights on, but that only made things worse. The harsh illumination created more shadows, more opportunities for my dark companion to assert its independence. I would lie in bed, watching the shadow cast by my body on the ceiling, and it would move with a restless energy that kept me awake despite my exhaustion. The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary evening. I was standing in my kitchen preparing dinner when I noticed my shadow on the opposite wall doing something I wasn't doing. While I chopped vegetables, it appeared to be writing something in the air with its finger. The movements were deliberate, purposeful, like someone trying to spell out words that only they could see. I stopped cutting and stared at the shadow. It continued its invisible writing, completely disconnected from my stillness. My hands began to shake, and the knife clattered to the counter. The shadow turned its head toward me, and even though it had no features, I could feel its attention like a physical weight. I reached for my phone to record what was happening, but the moment the camera app opened, my shadow returned to perfect mimicry. It waved when I waved, moved when I moved, as if it knew it was being watched by something other than just me. The performance was flawless, but I could sense the effort behind it, like an actor who had memorized their lines, but was still concentrating on delivering them correctly. That night, I tried to escape. I packed a bag and headed for the door, but my shadow stretched across the hallway, blocking my path. Not physically, I could still walk through it, but the wrongness of stepping through my own silhouette made my legs refuse to cooperate. I stood there, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing, until I finally turned around and went back inside. The next morning, I woke up to find that my shadow had grown bolder overnight. It no longer waited for me to move first. Instead, it seemed to be living its own life, gesturing and moving with a confidence that made my stomach turn. When I looked in the mirror, my reflection appeared to be following my shadow's lead rather than the other way around. I can feel it now, even as I write this. My shadow is leaning over my shoulder, reading along, its presence as real as my own breath. The pen in my hand feels heavier, as if someone else is guiding it across the page. The words I'm writing don't feel entirely like my own anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the shadow now, and it's the one casting me. The thought should terrify me, but instead, it brings a strange sense of relief. Perhaps I've been the copy all along, and it's finally time to step aside and let the original take control. The line between us is blurring, and I'm no longer sure which side of it I want to be on. Did you enjoy this story? The idea of a shadow slipping free, mirroring less, learning more, is a quiet kind of horror that creeps in sideways. It's not about sudden violence or screams, but that slow, subtle loss of control. That sense that something you trusted, something that is you, has started asking questions you can't answer. And when your reflection starts leading instead of following, who is really real anymore? What would you have done when the shadow started writing in the air? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us move on to the next story. Story 7. When I bought this place, the real estate agent gave me a blueprint. I didn't look at it until recently. That's when I noticed something impossible. There's an extra room on the plan, a narrow one tucked behind the kitchen wall. I walked the perimeter. No doors, no seams. But at night, I hear coughing from that side. Slow, wet breathing. I pressed my ear against the wall and felt heat like breath. It's not on the surface. It's buried inside. Someone or something lives in that room I can't reach. And the strange part is, I think they think I'm the guest. The blueprint arrived with a stack of documents I'd signed without reading. Moving boxes surrounded me for weeks, and the paper stayed buried beneath warranty cards and insurance forms. When I finally unfolded it, the kitchen layout looked wrong. According to the diagram, there should be a space behind the stove wall. A thin rectangle marked only as storage. I measured the kitchen with my hands, counting steps from corner to corner. The math didn't work. The wall was too thick, but from the outside, the house looked normal. I walked around the perimeter again, studying every angle. No additional windows. No extra doors. The siding ran smooth and unbroken. That first night, I heard something. A soft scratching like fingernails on wood. It came from the kitchen wall, the one that shouldn't exist. I pressed my palm against the surface and felt warmth spreading through the paint. Not electrical heat. Something organic. Something breathing. I started documenting everything. Measurements, sounds, temperatures. The wall stayed consistently warmer than the rest of the house, even when the heating was off. During quiet moments, I could hear movement inside. Shuffling footsteps. The creak of floorboards that shouldn't be there. The scratching grew more deliberate. Patterns emerged. 3 short scratches, then silence, then 3 more. I began recording the sounds with my phone, but the audio came out distorted. Voices mixed with static, words I couldn't quite understand. When I played the recordings back, they sounded different each time. Sometimes clearer, sometimes more garbled, as if someone was adjusting the volume from inside. I contacted the previous owner through the real estate agency. He claimed he'd never noticed anything unusual, but his voice carried a nervous edge. He hung up quickly when I mentioned the blueprint. The agency said they'd look into it, but no one ever called back. The scratching stopped being random. It followed a schedule. Every evening, just as darkness settled, 3 scratches would echo from the wall. I began responding with my own knocks, and something knocked back. Always the same pattern. Always 3. I bought a stud finder and ran it along the wall. It detected nothing where the studs should be, but registered strange readings in the center. The device beeped erratically, as if confused by what it was sensing. I tried drilling a small hole, but the bit met resistance after just an inch. Not wood, not metal, something that felt almost soft. The smell started after I attempted the drilling. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. It seeped through the paint, strongest near the floor. I sealed every gap I could find, but the odor persisted. At night, it grew stronger, mixing with something else. Something that reminded me of old books and forgotten spaces. I began spending hours pressed against the wall, listening. The breathing inside grew more pronounced. Sometimes I heard what sounded like whispers, but in a language I didn't recognize. The words felt familiar, like something I'd heard in dreams. I started whispering back, and the responses came faster. The blueprint began changing. Not obviously, but in small ways. Lines that seemed darker. Measurements that looked different. The mystery room appeared more detailed with each examination, as if someone was adding information. Windows that weren't there before. Furniture arranged in precise patterns. I hired a contractor to examine the wall. He spent an hour with his tools, then packed up quickly. He said the readings made no sense, that the wall seemed to exist in a space that shouldn't be possible. He left without completing his assessment, refusing payment. The temperature changes became more dramatic. The wall would pulse with heat, then drop to an uncomfortable cold. I could feel the variation through my clothes when I leaned against it. Sometimes the surface felt soft, yielding slightly under pressure. Other times it was hard as stone. My sleep suffered. The sounds from the wall grew louder, more insistent. Footsteps paced back and forth. Furniture scraped across a floor that couldn't exist. I began hearing voices clearly now, speaking in measured tones. They sounded like conversations, but I could only hear one side. I discovered something disturbing when I compared my lease to the blueprint. The lease described the apartment as having 4 rooms. The blueprint showed 5. The mystery room was listed with a monthly rent charge, as if someone was paying to live there. But the payment history showed only my name. The wall began showing marks. Faint impressions that looked like handprints pressed from the inside. They appeared gradually, becoming more visible each day. I traced them with my finger, and they felt warm. The prints were smaller than mine, with longer fingers. I started leaving notes against the wall. Simple messages written on paper and taped to the surface. Each morning, the papers would be gone, but new ones would appear, written in handwriting that wasn't mine, responding to questions I'd asked. The answers were always polite, always vague. The breakthrough came when I found the building's original architectural plans at the city planning office. The structure had been modified several times, but the earliest drawings showed that room clearly. It was labeled as living space, with its own entrance that had been sealed during a renovation decades ago. I realized someone had been living there all along. Someone who had been forgotten when the building was changed. Someone who had been receiving mail, paying rent, existing in a space that no longer officially existed. The scratching wasn't random. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement between neighbors. But the most unsettling discovery came when I found the current tenant registration. The mystery room was listed as occupied. The name on the lease was mine, but the handwriting wasn't. Someone had been signing documents in my name, maintaining their legal right to exist in that impossible space. I pressed my ear against the wall one final time. The breathing was steady now, comfortable, familiar. And I realized with growing horror that the sound matched my own rhythm perfectly. The resident inside wasn't just living there. They were living as me. The blueprint now shows my entire apartment as the mystery room. The space I occupy is marked as temporary storage. According to the official records, I'm the one who doesn't exist. The wall between us isn't keeping someone in. It's keeping me out. When I sleep, I dream of walking through rooms that match the blueprint exactly. Rooms where everything is arranged just as I would arrange it, but slightly wrong. And in those dreams, I can hear someone on the other side of the wall, someone who sounds exactly like me, trying to get in. Did you enjoy this story? The idea of a room that shouldn't exist, and yet does, is haunting enough. But discovering that you're not the rightful resident, that you're the intruder, that's a quiet, creeping nightmare. Especially when the other you has been waiting, watching, and rewriting reality around you. One wall at a time. What would you have done the moment the handprints appeared? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 8. I used to walk freely through the halls, but now the floor creaks before I step. Not after before, like it knows where I'll go. I experimented, took random steps, reversed directions, tiptoed silently. Still, the floorboards shifted in anticipation. Then came the laughter, quiet, barely audible under the groaning wood. Not human, just the impression of joy, like the house enjoyed getting it right. And last night, as I approached the bedroom, the door opened a moment early. The hinges didn't squeak. They sighed. And now I wonder if I'm walking through this house, or if it's walking me. The first sign was so subtle, I dismissed it as old wood settling. I'd been living here for weeks, adjusting to the rhythms of an unfamiliar place. The walls held decades of other people's lives, their scents lingering in the grain of the floorboards. Lavender soap, mixed with something sharper, more metallic. I told myself it was just the previous tenant's cleaning products, but the smell grew stronger near the staircase, as if something had been spilled there long ago and never properly cleaned. I started keeping a journal, not out of paranoia, but curiosity. The house seemed to respond to my presence in ways that felt too deliberate to ignore. When I walked from the kitchen to the living room, the floorboard by the window would creak a heartbeat before my foot touched it. When I turned toward the bathroom, the pipes would hum softly before I reached for the faucet. The house was learning my patterns, memorizing my routines like a devoted student. The recordings started as proof for myself. I'd set my phone to record, then walk my usual path from bedroom to kitchen. Playing it back, I could hear the floor anticipating each step, the wood groaning in perfect synchronization with movements I hadn't made yet. The sound quality was strange too. My footsteps seemed muffled, while the house's responses came through crystal clear, as if the recording device preferred its voice to mine. I began varying my routes, taking unexpected turns, pausing mid-stride to see if I could catch the house off guard. But it adapted quickly. Too quickly. Within days, it was predicting my detours, my hesitations, even my attempts to stay perfectly still. Standing motionless in the hallway, I'd feel the floorboards shift slightly beneath my feet, as if the house was adjusting its posture to match mine. The temperature changes came next. My breath would fog unexpectedly in warm rooms, but only when I was alone. When I had visitors, the house behaved normally, quiet, predictable, ordinary. But the moment they left, the walls would grow cold to the touch, and that metallic scent would return, stronger than before. I pressed my palms against the living room wall one evening, and it felt like touching skin. Not just the texture, but the subtle warmth, the almost imperceptible pulse underneath. The mirrors began reflecting things that weren't quite right. Nothing dramatic, just small discrepancies that made me doubt my own memory. I'd catch sight of myself in the hallway mirror, but my reflection would be facing a slightly different direction, as if it had been watching something just out of frame. The bathroom mirror was worse. Sometimes my reflection would smile before I did, or continue moving after I'd stopped. When I covered the mirrors with towels, the house grew quieter, sullen, like a child denied attention. I started sleeping with the lights on, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because darkness gave the house too much privacy. In the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I could see the walls breathing, subtle expansions and contractions that matched no rhythm I recognized. The ceiling would sag slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, returning to normal when I turned my gaze upward. The house was becoming restless, impatient with my resistance to its growing familiarity. Then came the whispers. Not voices exactly, but the impression of speech buried in the ambient sounds. The refrigerator's hum would occasionally form syllables. The heating system would click in patterns that felt like Morse code. I tried to record these sounds, but they never came through clearly on playback. Instead, I'd hear my own voice, distorted and unfamiliar, speaking words I didn't remember saying. The night everything changed, I was lying in bed, listening to the house settle around me. The familiar creaks and sighs had become almost comforting, like a lullaby. But then I heard something new, footsteps that weren't mine, moving through the downstairs rooms. Heavy, deliberate steps that followed the exact path I took every morning from bedroom to kitchen. The house was practicing my routine without me. I crept to the top of the stairs, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The footsteps continued below, unhurried and methodical. Kitchen cabinet opened and closed. Water ran in the sink. The refrigerator door seal broke with a soft pop. Someone was making breakfast using my exact morning routine, down to the specific order of tasks. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, the kitchen was empty, undisturbed. The only evidence was the lingering smell of coffee I hadn't made, and the faint warmth of a mug that sat clean in the cabinet. I stopped sleeping entirely. The house's behavior had become too intimate, too knowing. It had learned not just my footsteps, but my breathing patterns, my heartbeat, the way I moved through space. When I sat still, the walls would pulse in rhythm with my pulse. When I held my breath, the house would go silent, waiting. It was mimicking me, studying me, becoming me in ways that felt like a violation. During one particularly long, sleepless night, I decided to test the limits of what the house had learned. I sat in the middle of the living room floor and began moving in completely random patterns, stretching, rolling, crawling in directions that followed no logic. The house remained silent for several minutes, confused by my unpredictability. Then, slowly, it began to respond. The floorboards warmed beneath my hands. The walls seemed to lean inward, creating a cocoon of attention around me. The house wasn't just learning my patterns. It was learning to love them. I tried to leave the next morning, but my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over normally, but died immediately, as if something essential had been disconnected. I called a mechanic, but when he arrived, the car started perfectly. He found nothing wrong, shrugged, and drove away. The moment his truck disappeared around the corner, my car died again. The house wanted me to stay, and it was willing to sabotage my escape. The final revelation came when I found the photographs. Hidden in a drawer I'd never opened, yellowed pictures of previous tenants. Dozens of them spanning decades, all showing the same expression, a peculiar mix of contentment and resignation, as if they'd made peace with something they couldn't explain. On the back of each photo, someone had written dates and brief notes. House learned my schedule within 3 weeks. Mirrors show what I'm thinking. Footsteps follow mine exactly. The handwriting was different on each photo, but the words were eerily similar. I looked at the most recent photo. A woman who resembled me in build and coloring. On the back, in her careful script, the house doesn't want us to leave. It wants us to become part of it. I can feel myself changing. Some mornings I wake up and don't remember which footsteps were mine. Now I understand. The house doesn't just learn our patterns, it absorbs them, makes them part of its permanent memory. Every creak, every sigh, every whisper contains traces of all who lived here before. We leave impressions in the walls, in the floors, in the very air. The house collects us, preserves us, makes us immortal in its wooden bones and plaster skin. I've stopped trying to leave. The car starts now, but I no longer feel the urge to drive away. The house has become comfortable, familiar, like wearing clothes that fit perfectly. When I walk through the halls, I can't tell if the footsteps I hear are mine or echoes of those who came before. The mirrors show faces that might be mine, or might be memories the house has kept. Sometimes, late at night, I hear new footsteps upstairs, lighter, more tentative than mine. The house is expecting someone new, someone who will walk these halls and leave fresh impressions for it to learn and love and keep. I find myself looking forward to their arrival, curious about what patterns they'll bring, what rhythms they'll add to the house's growing symphony of lives. The realtor will tell them it's a quiet neighborhood, a peaceful house with character. She won't mention how the floors creak in anticipation, or how the walls pulse with accumulated heartbeats. She won't explain that the house learns quickly, loves deeply, and never forgets. But they'll discover this for themselves just as I did, just as everyone before me did. And when they do, I'll be here in the walls, in the floors, in the spaces between their footsteps, helping the house learn their rhythms, teaching it to love them as it learned to love me. We'll all be here, a chorus of patterns and memories, forever walking through halls that know exactly where we're going before we take our first step. Did you enjoy this story? The idea that a house could learn you, mimic you, and slowly absorb everything that makes you you. It's as beautiful as it is terrifying. Not with violence, but with quiet, devoted imitation. Until you're no longer sure if you're walking through the house, or if the house is walking you. What would you do if your home started predicting your every move? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's move on to the next story. Story 9. The lighting is always the same. The position, my face, but the reflection never quite matches. My clothes sometimes differ. A bruise appears I don't remember earning. Once, I saw myself blink before I did, but today it changed completely. Behind me in the reflection stood a figure, tall, unmoving, while I stood alone in the room. When I turned, nothing. But the figure didn't vanish in the mirror. It walked away. The reflection is no longer showing me now. It's showing what I'm going to see, or what's going to see me. The mirror sits in my bedroom, ancient and ornate, inherited from someone whose name I've forgotten. Its silver surface has that peculiar quality of old glass, slightly warped, creating subtle distortions that I initially blamed for the inconsistencies. The frame bears intricate carvings that seem to shift in my peripheral vision, though they remain motionless when I look directly. I started keeping a journal after the first incident. Small things, barely worth noting. A scratch on my cheek that wasn't there when I went to bed. A shirt I don't remember putting on. The reflection would show these details before they appeared on my actual body, as if the mirror existed a few heartbeats ahead of reality. The temperature around the mirror fluctuates without reason. Sometimes the glass feels warm to the touch, other times cold enough to fog with my breath. The condensation forms patterns that look almost like writing, though I can never quite make out the words before they fade. I began documenting everything. Photographs of my reflection, noting discrepancies. Audio recordings of the soft scratching sounds that emanate from behind the glass when the room falls silent. The sounds grow louder when I press my ear against the mirror's surface, like fingernails dragging across wood from the other side. The figure appeared gradually. First, just a shadow at the edge of the reflection, easily dismissed as a trick of the light. Then, a silhouette that lingered longer each day. Eventually, it took shape, tall, wearing clothes that mirror my own, but darker, older. Its face remains unclear, features that seem to shift and blur when I try to focus on them. I attempted to break the mirror once. The hammer struck the glass with a sharp crack, but the surface remained intact. Instead, the sound echoed from within the reflection, as if I had struck something on the other side. The figure in the mirror turned toward me then, and I saw it raise its hand to touch what must have been its own version of the glass. The most disturbing discovery came when I realized the figure wasn't just copying my movements. It was anticipating them. It would reach for objects before I decided to pick them up, turn toward sounds before they occurred in my room. The reflection had become a preview, showing me actions I hadn't yet chosen to take. I started avoiding the mirror, covering it with sheets, but the reflection persisted. The fabric became transparent in the mirror world, and I could see the figure moving freely now, no longer bound to mimic my presence. It explored the reflected version of my room, touching objects, opening drawers, examining my belongings with careful attention. The smell began subtly, a musty odor like old paper and dust. It grew stronger near the mirror, carrying hints of something else, something organic and unfamiliar. When I breathed deeply, trying to identify it, the scent would shift, becoming almost familiar, like a memory just out of reach. One morning, I woke to find handprints on the mirror's surface, pressed against the glass from the inside. The prints were larger than mine, with longer fingers. When I placed my hand against them, the glass vibrated slightly, and I felt a corresponding pressure, as if something on the other side was pressing back. The figure began leaving me messages. Objects in the reflected room would be arranged differently, spelling out words or creating patterns. Books opened to specific pages, clothes arranged in deliberate shapes. The messages were never clear, but the intention was unmistakable. It was trying to communicate, to reach across whatever barrier separated us. I realized the reflection was no longer showing my room at all. The walls had changed color, the furniture had shifted, and objects appeared that I didn't own. The figure had taken over completely, and I was now watching its world instead of my own. But somehow, impossibly, it was still my reflection staring back at me. The barrier between worlds began to weaken. I could hear sounds from the other side more clearly now. Footsteps, voices, the creak of floorboards. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, nothing had changed in my actual room. Only the mirror showed the truth of what was happening. The figure finally faced me directly, and I saw my own features staring back, but changed. Aged, weathered, marked by experiences I had never lived. Its eyes held knowledge I didn't possess, and when it smiled, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It began to mouth words, speaking silently through the glass. I couldn't hear the voice, but I could read the message on its lips. The same phrase repeated over and over. The words made no sense, yet they felt familiar, as if I had heard them before in dreams I couldn't remember. The reflection stopped following my movements entirely. While I stood before the mirror, it sat in its version of my room, writing in a journal that matched my own. When it finished, it held up the pages for me to see. The writing was in my handwriting, but the words described events that hadn't happened yet. The final entry was different. Instead of describing future events, it contained a single line, written in letters that seemed to burn themselves into the paper. The door is opening. I felt the mirror's surface soften under my touch. No longer solid glass, but something more like water. My reflection reached toward me from the other side, and I realized with growing horror that I was reaching back, my hand moving without conscious direction. The temperature in the room plummeted. The musty smell intensified, now carrying the unmistakable scent of something that had been buried too long. The handprints on the mirror multiplied, dozens of them now, all pressed against the glass from inside. My reflection's mouth opened, and this time I heard the voice, distorted and echoing, speaking words that came from my own throat. I've been waiting for you to notice. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, and I felt myself being pulled forward, drawn into the reflection that was no longer mine. The figure on the other side had become solid, real, while I felt myself becoming translucent, fading into the glass. The room behind the mirror was exactly like mine, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. shadows fell in impossible directions. The proportions seemed slightly off, and the air itself felt thick and wrong. I realized I was no longer looking at a reflection. I was looking at a replacement. The figure smiled at me with my own face, and I understood finally what had been happening. It hadn't been showing me the future. It had been showing me the past. All those small differences, those inconsistencies, they were memories of who I used to be before something else began living my life. Now I stand on the other side of the glass, watching the figure live in my world, wearing my face, sleeping in my bed. I press my hands against the mirror's surface, leaving prints that will puzzle the next person who looks too closely at their reflection. The mirror still doesn't reflect the same day, but now I know why. It's not showing what will happen. It's showing what has already been taken. And I'm no longer sure which side of the glass holds the real world. I can hear new sounds now from rooms I've never seen, from mirrors in houses I've never visited. The scratching, the whispers, the soft footsteps. We're all here, everyone who looked too long, who noticed too much, who let the reflection become more real than the original. The figure has learned to be me perfectly. It walks through my life, speaks with my voice, lives my days. But sometimes, when it passes by the mirror, I catch it looking back at me with eyes that hold too much knowledge, too much patience. I understand now why the reflection never quite matched. It wasn't showing me a different version of myself. It was showing me what I would become. And now that I'm here, trapped behind the glass, I can see the next person approaching, drawn by the same subtle inconsistencies that once puzzled me. The mirror doesn't reflect the same day because it's not meant to. It's meant to collect them, to gather up the moments and the people who lived them, storing them safely behind the glass where they can't interfere with whatever is taking their place. I watch the figure that wears my face, and I wonder if it knows I'm still here, still watching, still waiting, or if it has forgotten me entirely, the way I had forgotten about the person who came before, the one whose reflection I had slowly replaced. The mirror shows truth, but not the truth you expect. It shows what you will become when something else decides to become you. And now I wait, patient as the figure once was, for the next person who will look too closely at their reflection and notice that something isn't quite right. The lighting is always the same. The position, the face, but the reflection never quite matches. And now I know why. Did you enjoy this story? There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that your reflection might not be yours at all. That it's studying you, preparing to replace you. The realization that the mirror isn't copying you, it's becoming you. What would you do if your reflection moved before you did? Let me know in the comments.